Here we are for another bonus round of the 70s versus the 90s. And in this round, we have Colin Higgins' Foul Play versus John Badham's Bird on a Wire. And, this one, it's at the heart of it right here. It's Goldie versus Goldie. We see Goldie Hawn in the 70s and the 90s paired with a male romantic lead that should complement her. And so that at the heart is what this one's going to be about. So starting off with Foul Play, directed by Colin Higgins, who also did The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. And, the film has a lot of funny moments. At its heart, it's kind of a Hitchcockian comedy, in a way, a sort of parody, and almost a better parody than Mel Brooks's High Anxiety when it comes to Hitchcock stuff. And, we see Goldie Hawn, she's, newly single after getting divorced, and, she's kind of not really desperate to find love, but still kind of wanting to find love and shit. So, she sees immediately, you kind of see this isn't your ordinary chick. She sees Chevy Chase be a dumbass, and then she says, I'm out, and then they kind of have they meet in and out, kind of the weird, zany kind of romantic comedies that you would see in the 30s and 40s. And, all in all, like, there's a lot of great gags in it. And, the Goldie Hawn is a more of a stronger, like, female character than you would see in these types of movies. And we also see Chevy Chase in his first actual film role. In this, they're trying to mold him to be the new Cary Grant, when in reality, you got Goldie Hawn playing the type of part that Cary Grant, or even Jimmy Stewart for that matter, would play in a Hitchcock film, because we see her pick up a handsome stranger after the opening credits, that sultry Barry Manilow song, and that dude ends up like slipping her some kind of microfilm and shit, and she doesn't know what it is. That's your MacGuffin, because it's the thing everybody's always chasing, but nobody really knows or gives a fuck about what it's about. It's all for the chase. It's what looks cinematic and shit, but also at the same time, they're making fun of it while also like taking it seriously, and at times this film does take itself a little too seriously, but there are moments where it's just laugh out loud funny, like the Dudley Moore sequences, especially when she ends up at his apartment, watching out for the albino, which is, and then that's one of the things. The villains in this movie are absolutely absurd. They're kind of meant to be, in the play on the names, like with that Billy Barty sequence where, that dude gets fucked up beyond all repair. It's fucking hilarious. It has some very high moments, but there's some very low ones, especially when it gets to taking itself too seriously. And the ending is kind of lame because, honestly, like, I don't really see those characters getting together. I feel like it's just more, kind of ended on some Hollywood bullshit and stuff, where like they're kissing and then the fucking curtain unfurls and shit, right where they got the people hanging from the nets and all that shit, but then everybody's applauding because, all it's love and shit. If like Chevy Chase had like fell through the fucking stage and did some shit like that, that would have been the funniest fall in the movie. Not that bullshit one that he does off that fucking like pier that's got like a piece of the fucking railing missing, and you can tell that's just so forced. It's lame as fuck, but it's just like, oh, look how cool I am at doing falls, because, say what you will about Chevy Chase, but, he was a fucking, great comedic mind, as far as like doing the fucking pratfalls and shit. He had that down to a science, just doing bumble ass shit, He had a certain finesse with it, fucking asshole, but like, funny as fuck when it comes to that shit. But he had still hadn't come into his own because he hadn't separated the fucking I'm Chevy Chase and you're not when he's doing this film. Later in the 80s was the vacation movies and Funny Farm and Spies Like Us. He's able to fucking detach from that, but not really in this one. And there's not much chemistry between these characters, and I feel like, even though dude kind of helps her with all the shit, I doubt that would be enough for her to like not see through his bullshit, but I get it's a comedy, reading too much into it maybe, but even comedies gotta make sense, it's just one of those things. And then we move forward to Bird on a Wire, where it's kind of and another like play on like Norrish Hitchcockian themes and shit, because this has a familiar plot like Out of the Past and The Killers, where there's a guy hiding out from a bunch of gangsters and shit. In this case, like rogue, corrupt DEA agents and shit, and you got Mel Gibson working at a gas station, similar to like Robert Mitchum and fucking Out of the Past, and he's spotted by his old flame Goldie Hawn, and they clearly have a past, because when they see each other, that you feel that shit. There it's a very heartbreaking moment where like he's trying to hide himself from her, and she's trying to see if that's really him and shit, because he's supposedly died in a plane crash and shit. And then a lot of other chaos ensues because he's in the witness protection program, and now he's on the run with her, and you see all the different fucking personas that he undertook as being a hairdresser and shit, and like fucking even working at an animal farm, a veterinarian clinic and shit. And so that shit's really funny, even though the movie itself is more serious than say Foul Play, because what's weird is like Foul Play is clearly a comedic parody of the shit that it's trying to be, but then at times it just kind of takes itself way too seriously, but then also times you'll be cry laughing, like when Burgess Meredith throws that fucking cup at that dude's head. Burgess Meredith and that fight with him and Rachel Roberts is fucking hilarious too. So like this movie's basically like a series of moments, whereas like Bird on a Wire is more linear and shit, and the villains are way better. They're not silly tropes like albinos and dwarfs and priests and shit like that. And I guess that's meant to be funny, but even that in and of itself doesn't really land like motherfuckers probably thought it should. Whereas like you got David Carradine and Bill Duke as like corrupt DEA agents trying to kill this motherfucker who's working for and it also has a fucking guy on the inside of the FBI, Steven Tobolowsky, who's very funny in and of itself. Like his shit's very like insane, because like that dude's just a wormy motherfucker and he plays it cold, and like these motherfuckers, like Mel Gibson doesn't really have a chance, but he's got his girl Goldie Hawn and they're dealing with shit, and so it's almost like if Frank Capra had made a fucking Hitchcock movie, but it's really fun, and Mel Gibson's a lot more charming than Chevy Chase, and the chemistry that Gibson has with Goldie Hawn is incredible too. Like you understand why they get together at the end of the movie, as opposed to like her and Chevy Chase at the end of Foul Play. So I guess I got to give it to Bird on a Wire with this one, because it's a straight action film too, but it's also very funny in parts. Mel Gibson kind of had that ability to be like Cary Grant by way of Steve McQueen. He was able to like have like interact with strong female leads in a way that like McQueen couldn't, and so like it's Bird on a Wire. And also it's not as like, it doesn't always take itself that seriously as Foul Play does, and also that because even the climax of Foul Play in the theater thing with the intercut with the Mikado, that's all right, but I mean that fucking shootout at the end of Bird on a Wire at the fucking zoo and shit, like that shit's pretty fucking nuts. The way they got the fucking chimp shooting the gun and shit, that this movie's fucking wild as shit, and it ends the way it should, because at the end of the day, this is a movie. So I mean, what works better as a movie? Some shit I'd want to watch over and over again. It's got to be Bird on a Wire. So for anybody keeping score on that shit, it's 13-12. 70s are only up by 1. 90s have been coming back with a fucking vengeance. All these bonus rounds and shit. So, we'll see how, who knows if a bonus round will come up and tie them up again, or if the 70s will just keep fucking smoking the 90s, because it goes up and down like this. Like my curiosity's peaked so high, I got to keep doing these fucking things until my eyes bleed and shit. So, but anywho, 13-12. 70s are still up by 1, but it looks like the 90s are coming back, because they had an ability to pair, like the casting got a lot better, maybe the stars got a lot better, I don't know, but and I would probably say, if we're going off of the Goldie Hawn's character is they're probably on the same level of strength, You know, the one in foul play may be a little stronger, but the fact that she goes with Chevy Chase at the end kind of takes points away, as opposed to like you get why she ends up with Mel Gibson at the end of Bird on a Wire. And you know, yeah, sure, she screams a lot more in Bird on a Wire, but you know, she gets into a lot more crazier situations. I mean, she does kind of have a big freak out moment when she, you know, throws Billy Barty out of the window in foul play. So it's got to go to the 90s on this one for me. And so, like I said, 13-12, 70s is still up by one, and it's heating up. So, like I said, if you disagree or don't like anything that I've said, feel free to comment. You know, any suggestions, I'll be glad to take them. I don't give a fuck. You know, I got all kinds of matchups in mind, and I'm going to be doing all this shit whenever I get free time and shit. So, you know, we're just working on the rough draft of my doctoral thesis so I can go to grad school and shit. So, and then the main event coming up is Jaws versus Lake Placid. So that should be somewhere around Saturday. So look forward to that shit. And bonus rounds abound. Summer's heating up. Fuck it.